Welcome to Trashmagination, a podcast about reimagining trash. I'm Carla Brown. Today's episode is about buttons. And by this, I mean the devices on our clothing that go in buttonholes. Not the kind that you pin on your lapel and not the kind that you find on an electronic device. I have a fabulous button collection, mostly because of my mom, who gave me her button collection when she was downsizing. It is sorted by color into about 15 jars. She had such a huge collection of buttons because she used to teach classes on how to make button necklaces. She made all different designs for different shapes of buttons. Most of her necklaces had a thin elastic cord that went around the neck, and then the buttons were either attached directly to the cord through the holes, or groups of them were attached to the cord with metal rings. This year, I made a small denim quilt from scraps, and on each square, I sewed a piece of velvet that used to be an upholstery sample book piece of velvet, and then on each piece of velvet, I sewed a beautiful button. So I only need to make about 100 more of these quilts, and I will use up all my buttons. Or I could get inspired by some of the projects that I will share in today's podcast episode. Now, you might be thinking, why are we talking about buttons on a podcast about creative reuse of trash? Are buttons trash? Well, I can tell you that if you get into the practice of upcycling clothing, you are going to be removing buttons, and then you will have too many buttons. So buttons are kind of an outcome of creative reuse that requires their own creative reuse solutions. When I used to teach art at my children's schools, we always did a unit on pointillism, which is a technique of making tiny dots in order to make a larger image. Pointillism was invented by Georges Seurat, who experimented with putting dots very near to each other or sometimes overlaying different colors to see how it would affect how the brain saw the colors. His goal was to make the color even more luminous in his paintings, and the students always enjoyed working on this unit. Making art with buttons definitely is connected to pointillism. If you view each button as a little dot of color and then you group them together, you can play with color in the same way. So now you'll see how the artists that I'm going to talk about today play with this concept of both color and placement in their work. One of the most well-known artists who works with buttons is Jane Perkins. Over the years, I have been doing creative reuse. Many people have sent me photos of Jane's work, and that's because she does very realistic portraits of well-known celebrities that people know made with buttons, and then also she uses other plastic items like small plastic toys. She also recreates classic artworks with buttons. She doesn't really do a lot of sharing on social media, so the best place to see her latest work is her website. Now, Jane's technique involves using a glue gun to attach her buttons and other plastic items to her pieces. The next artist I would hope that you would check out is Deniz Sağdıç. She works often with denim to make portraits, and then she also has made portraits using the many buttons that she removed from the denim jeans that she used. Those buttons come in many shades of metallic colors. If you have ever tried to remove a button from a pair of jeans, then you know it is not easy. They are attached using a metal rivet. To make her portraits, she punches the posts from the rivets in a pattern on a base piece of cloth, and then she attaches the right colors of metal jean buttons to make her designs. Deniz is from Turkey, and she was featured in that Turkish documentary TV show that I mentioned in a previous episode, which is all about artists who works with recycled materials. Unfortunately, her video is not translated into English, so I'm not sure what she is saying, but it still is very worthwhile to watch the video to see her process. The next artist who works with buttons is Hwang, who builds huge images of palaces, dragons, birds, and plum blossom trees. She tells a story about how she was living in Brooklyn during 9/11, and the ash from the burning buildings landed in her backyard. It reminded her of a gate in Korea that also was burned down to ash. And her buttons are like tiny pieces of ash that build up to a larger image. Ron attaches each button in place with pins, hammering them into a wooden or plexiglass panel. She describes this repetitive act of hammering as something like a meditation. When she hammers the button into the panel, she doesn't hammer the pin all the way in. It sticks out, and then she can slide the button so it is very close to the panel, or midway down the pin, or very near the head of the pin. And this makes it look like it's more movable and more alive. This is a type of work that is very inspiring to look at from up close, and it's also great to look at far away to see both the level of detail and texture as well as the overall effect. In other sculptures, Ron incorporates string connecting the buttons and the pins. Her piece called The Spider's Stratagem uses the string to look like the spider webbing connecting the buttons. She also incorporates crystals to make her sculptures shine. Another way that her sculptures shine is that she will sometimes incorporate video into her exhibitions. And this makes the sculpture look like it's maybe moving. So for example, it might look like blossoms are falling from the trees or water is rushing through, and the light reflects off the shiny buttons and crystals. The sculptures are suspended in the room with a screen behind, and so that when the light from the video shines through, it can make patterns on a screen behind the sculptures. The next artist actually sews buttons onto her artwork with thread. Can you believe it? We finally got to an artist who uses thread to sew buttons. Anne Carrington made a series called The Pearly Queens, which were images of Queen Elizabeth on postage stamps blown up to a very large size and made on red or black velvet. Often she uses shiny buttons like pearl, gold, and silver. She was asked to make a banner for the Diamond Jubilee in 2012 to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Ascension of Queen Elizabeth. This large banner was displayed on the royal barge as it traveled up the River Thames. You can see a time-lapse video showing how this banner was made and then how it was displayed on the barge. And you can see how it took a whole team of people sewing to make the banner. It looks like an exhausting job. All of these artists that we've talked about so far make their artwork by attaching buttons to a flat surface. But our next artist does something completely different. Augusto Esquivel makes 2- and 3-dimensional sculptures by suspending buttons on strings. He builds a transparent acrylic box, and the top of the box is a grid of holes. He then attaches clear monofilament string, one from each hole. He then slides the buttons onto the strings so they make a shape. It's like each button is a large pixel in that 3-dimensional image. Another thing that he does, which is quite different from the previous artists, is that he spray paints his buttons so they are the same color. That makes sense because he is already asking you to process something that might seem abstract with these buttons hanging down from the strings, and he relies on the buttons being exactly the same color so your brain can process what this is meant to be, that it's a singular object. He would never be able to find enough buttons that are just naturally the same color without probably driving himself around the bend. He also makes celebrity portraits using only black, white, and gray buttons. Augusto says his first goal is to make you smile and to evoke feelings from childhood. He started making art from buttons because it reminded him of his grandmother, who he was very close to. If you are inspired to make art from buttons, there are so many examples of button art on Pinterest, and I invite you to the Trashmagination Pinterest board on buttons. There are also multiple Facebook groups dedicated just to making crafts from buttons. There are many designs for making holiday ornaments, and I don't know if you've ever looked at a pink button, but it makes the perfect snout for a pig. There are also people who creatively reuse buttons to make wedding bouquets by combining them with costume jewelry. Now, some people collect antique buttons, and chances are good that none of the buttons in your sewing basket are actually antique. But if you find a button and it looks interesting, it might actually be an antique. You can contact the National Button Society for their expertise in deciding whether you have a true antique. Some examples of vintage buttons are Bakelite and Lucite buttons, which were considered to be the first plastic products. Perfume buttons, which had a velvet backing where Victorian ladies would put perfume that was too irritating to be applied directly to their skin, and also Civil War soldiers would take them into battle to remember their loved ones. And then there are also buttons with political messages, such as those that were made for George Washington's first inauguration. Another type of button craft that I find interesting is making handmade buttons from thread and fabric. These are sometimes called Dorset buttons. Some people make these buttons for reenactment costumes or other historical costumes. There are intricate tutorials for how you can make your own thread buttons using ordinary embroidery thread. In terms of reusing buttons these days, many people have been sewing them to headbands or hats, so you can hook your mask around the button instead of your ears. This is especially helpful for people who are sensitive about having the elastic around their ears, such as people with autism or people who have to wear a lot of protective gear for many hours. Another way people creatively reuse buttons is to sew them onto padded hangers to keep dresses and tank tops from sliding off onto the floor. Thank you for listening. If you have made something cool from recycled buttons, or you have seen art made from recycled buttons, please let me know at trashmagination@gmail.com. Until next time, may you see buttons as a source of art in your life.